This is Chapter 3 for criminal procedure, the authority to detain, arrest, and use of force. We are shifting gears now. We're leaving the First Amendment and moving on to another amendment that we are going to spend considerable time on this semester. And that amendment is the Fourth Amendment. And the Fourth Amendment has a couple different rights that we're going to go over. And chapters 3 and 4 pertain to the Fourth Amendment. So probably the next 5 or 6 or maybe even longer weeks, we're going to be spending learning about the Fourth Amendment. And we're going to start off with chapter 3. Now your midterm is coming up, and what you are going to learn today in regards to chapter 3 is also going to be on the midterm. So the midterm will be chapters 1, 2, and chapter 3 up until what you learn today. After the midterm, and actually it's going to be after spring break, is when we will pick up with the remainder of chapter 3 and then move on to chapter 4. So only the first half of chapter 3, which we're going to learn today, will be on the midterm. The midterm itself is going to be 40 objective questions, meaning true, false, multiple choice, and matching. There are no essays on the exam. However, many of the multiple choice questions are short, fact-based scenarios where you really need to know and understand the material in order to decipher what the right answer is going to be. So don't be fooled by thinking it's an objective test, it's just true, false, and multiple choice, and I only have to memorize terms. It's not that kind of exam. It's a kind of exam that, yes, most of it is multiple choice. However, you really need to understand the material to answer the questions correctly. So there'll be more that I'll be sending out about the midterm, the date, and a little bit more on the exam itself. And I'll also be providing a study guide for you. So on to chapter 3, authority to detain, arrest, and use of force. There's some important terms that you need to understand before we really get into the material. And this is for the rest of the semester. You're going to be hearing these terms over and over, and you really need to understand them in order to really understand the material. And the first term that we're going to learn is called objective viewpoint. You will see this many times. And what does an objective viewpoint mean? It means it's the viewpoint from a reasonable person. So many times we're going to apply this test called the totality of the circumstances in order to determine if the Fourth Amendment was violated. And sometimes the totality of the circumstances test is from an objective viewpoint. And then sometimes it's from a subjective viewpoint, which we'll get into in a minute. And this is why it's important. You need to understand the difference between objective viewpoint and subjective viewpoint. So again, objective viewpoint is from the viewpoint of a reasonable person. It is not from the viewpoint of the actual person. So when we're looking at a scenario and the person being, let's just say, detained by the police, John Smith is being detained by the police, and we want to determine if that's a legal detention, we don't do it from what John Smith is thinking, feeling, or from his viewpoint. We do it from what we call a reasonable person, the objective viewpoint. It has nothing to do with the actual person. This reasonable person is a hypothetical person that our jurisprudence system has made up. And many times we're going to use this objective viewpoint. So when you see objective, know that we're going to take the actual person that's involved in the situation. We're going to remove them and substitute them for this reasonable person, which brings us to subjective viewpoint. There are also going to be times when we will use a subjective viewpoint instead of an objective viewpoint. And when it's subjective, it's the opposite of objective. Now we want to know the viewpoint of the actual person. We're not going to substitute that person for a reasonable person. We want to keep the actual person and know what their viewpoint is, what they felt, what they knew, and what their past experiences are. So it's anything that is personal to the actual person. So when we are asked a subjective viewpoint, we are going to look at that actual person. And then another term that you need to be familiar with is, you'll read this, it's called de facto. And de facto is Latin for actual. And you will see the term de facto arrest. And what that means is an actual arrest. So you will see the term de facto. And these are three terms that you need to get comfortable with and really just need to understand them. So when you see them, you'll know what they mean and how to apply them. And we are on to the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment happens to be my favorite amendment. And although the First Amendment is a close second, I enjoy everything about the Fourth Amendment, and a lot of my criminal practice has to do with the Fourth Amendment and whether the police violate the Fourth Amendment. So if you look and to the right, you see it says Fourth Amendment, and those words are the actual amendment. That's what it says. So take a minute and read that. And then tell me what word, well, not tell me, but tell yourself what word you think is the key word, the most important word in that document. And the word we're going to focus on is unreasonable. And you see, it's the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. The key word is unreasonable. Therefore, what this is telling us is that when the police take action under the Fourth Amendment, whatever action they take, whether it's a search or a seizure, it must be reasonable. Because the Fourth Amendment prohibits the police from acting unreasonably. And that's what we're going to learn about the Fourth Amendment is when is it reasonable or unreasonable when the police act? That's what we're going to learn. So your first video question, this class hasn't had video questions yet. So this is the first time that you do it. You'll see on your homework assignment that the third question says video question 1. And the question is, what is the key word in the Fourth Amendment? And under question 3 on your homework assignment, you put unreasonable. The key word in the Fourth Amendment is unreasonable. And that is a word that you're going to hear over and over in some form, whether it's unreasonable or reasonable. You're going to hear me say it hundreds of times in the next few weeks. So why do we have a Fourth Amendment? And we're going to go back again in time much like what we've learned about why we have the Constitution in the first place and why we had the First Amendment and all these other amendments, the reason why we had the Fourth Amendment is really because of the way that the British were treating us when we were colonies. And one of the things they did that we didn't particularly like was they would be able to come into our houses at any time without any grounds, meaning they didn't need any suspicion. They could just barge into our houses at any time because we were their colonies and there was no protection from us or for us from the British government. And so when we became our own nation, our own country, we added the Fourth Amendment because we said we never want to have a government that is going to be able to just unreasonably search us, seize us, come into our houses. We're going to protect us from this new government that we formed. So they created the Fourth Amendment, which protects us from the government acting unreasonably when it comes to searching or seizing us or our property. So the Fourth Amendment covers two things. Think of the Fourth Amendment as an umbrella. And under this Fourth Amendment umbrella, we have searches and we have seizures. And the book breaks up searches and seizures into different chapters. In this chapter, we are going to concentrate on seizures. Chapter 3 is about seizures. We'll get to searches in chapter 4. So what rights does the Fourth Amendment guarantee? Two things: the right against unreasonable seizures and the right against unreasonable searches. Those are the two things that the Fourth Amendment protects us from. For this chapter, we're going to concentrate on seizures. Again, we will get into searches next chapter, in chapter 4. So when does the Fourth Amendment apply in terms of seizures? Does it apply if an officer is speaking with somebody? Every time an officer speaks with somebody, does the Fourth Amendment come into play? Does it come into play if the officer is detaining that person and patting them down? Does it come into play if they are arresting that person? And does it come into play if they are not arrested, but they are using some type of force? And in that last picture, certainly pointing a gun at somebody is a show of force. So when, out of these four scenarios, when do you think the Fourth Amendment would apply? And the answer is the first three. And it would not apply in the last one where the officer is speaking with the little girl. And we'll learn why as we go along. Here we go again. And I'm going to drive this point home because it's so important for you to understand. The Fourth Amendment is all about reasonable actions by the police. If the police act unreasonably when they search or seize someone or something, then it violates the Fourth Amendment. In regards to seizures, for a seizure, what is reasonable will depend on what type or what class of seizure is occurring. Because what may be reasonable for a detainment may not be reasonable for an arrest. So depending on the type or the class of seizure is going to depend on whether or not that action was reasonable or not. And we have police encounters. In those 4 cartoon pictures that I showed you, those were all encounters with the police. And we have voluntary or consent encounters. We have investigative stops or detainment, and we have arrest. These are the type of encounters that people have with the police, or police have with citizens. Out of these 3, only 2 of them are seizures under the 4th Amendment. So remember, the 4th Amendment covers searches and seizures. We're concentrating on seizures. So out of these 3, only 2 of them are going to be considered seizures under the 4th Amendment. And those 2 are investigative stops and arrest. If a seizure occurs, then the police need some level of suspicion to conduct the seizure. Depending on the type or the class of seizure will depend on what level of suspicion is required. As we're going to learn, if the police arrest somebody, that's going to require a different level of suspicion than if they conduct an investigative stop, or sometimes called a detainment. And so here is a chart for you, and this is posted on e-learning under 4th Amendment material. And you can print out a copy if you like. This will help you visually understand. And as we go along, we're going to fill in these 3 blank boxes. So as we go along, we're going to learn the level of suspicion needed for consent, investigative stop, and arrest. And when we're done, these 3 boxes will be filled in with the level of suspicion that is needed. So what if this guy was walking to class? He was on his way to school, and the police officer says, Officer Friendly says, "Hello, do you mind if I talk to you for a minute?" And the kid says, "Yeah, sure, I'll talk to you." Do the police need any level of suspicion to do that? Do the police have to have some level of suspicion to say to this kid, "Excuse me, can I stop and talk to you? Can you stop and talk to me for a minute, please?" And what if the kid says, "Screw you, I'm late for class. Now, if I'm late for class, I'm going to get an F, so I'm not going to stop." And the officer says, "Well, you better stop because we're ordering you to stop." Do the police need suspicion then? And the first one that I described is what we call a voluntary or a consent encounter. So if you remember, the officer was asking the student, "Excuse me, can I stop and talk to you for a minute?" So that begs the question, can a police officer walk up to someone and ask them to stop if the officer has no suspicion that the person committed a crime? Now, this officer wants to speak with this student for some reason, but the officer does not have any suspicion to believe that the student is involved in something suspicious or criminal. Can that officer ask that person to stop if he does not have any suspicion? And the answer to that is yes, because if you remember, I said a few slides ago, is that with the three types of encounters that the police have, voluntary, investigative stops, and arrests, only two of them, investigative stops and arrests, are called seizures. And that's what the Fourth Amendment covers, is seizures. So because it doesn't cover voluntary encounters, then the officer does not need any level of suspicion to ask someone if to stop for them. So the level of suspicion needed for a voluntary or consent encounter is 0, zip, zilch, nada. They don't need any suspicion to ask somebody to stop. The police can do that. Now, the person can always say no, like that student. Sorry, I'm late for class. No. And if the officer does not have any suspicion, there's nothing the officer can do about that. Maybe eat a little crow and say, okay, have a good day, and walk away. But if the officer doesn't have any suspicion and the person doesn't consent to that encounter, then the officer cannot stop that person. And the person saying no to a consent encounter does not give the police suspicion to stop that person. Whenever you exercise your right, and this student is exercising their right by saying no, whenever you exercise your right, that can't be used against you. So the fact that the student says no to the police cannot take that and say, well, now I have suspicion to stop you because you said no, so you must be up to something no good. Doesn't work like that. So because no level of suspicion is needed, a hunch is okay. And we're going to see in a scale in a little bit where a hunch falls in. But a hunch is a gut feeling. It's nothing that an officer can point to, nothing they can describe. It's just a hunch or a gut feeling. And a hunch and a gut feeling is not good enough to detain somebody or arrest somebody, but it's good enough for a consent encounter, because a consent encounter doesn't involve the Fourth Amendment. Therefore, it doesn't need any suspicion. So a hunch is okay for an officer to ask a person to stop for them, a consent encounter. The police can approach anyone at any time to ask anything. The person can always say no. And because it is a request and the officer has no suspicion, the person is free to walk away and not stop for the officer. Now, if the officer does have reasonable suspicion and the officer says, excuse me, can I speak with you for a minute? And the person says no. If the officer has reasonable suspicion, as we're going to learn, then the officer can detain that person, make them stop. Minus any level of suspicion, whether it's reasonable suspicion or probable cause, if that person says no, when the officer asks them to stop, there's nothing the officer can do about that. So the Fourth Amendment does not apply because it's voluntary. It's not a seizure. The officer isn't seizing that person. The person is consenting and voluntarily stopping for that officer. So the Fourth Amendment does not apply. And so we can fill in box number 1 under consent. The level of suspicion needed for consent is none. The police can ask anyone at any time to stop and speak with them without any suspicion. So we will move into now investigative stop and arrest. And these are called seizures. So what is a seizure? A seizure is not a voluntary encounter. So if you see on an exam where the officer asked the person to stop and the officer did not have any level of suspicion, That is what we call a voluntary encounter. The definition of a seizure is when a person's freedom of movement is deprived and brought under control by an officer. So when that student is walking and the officer detains that person, the person doesn't say, yes, I'll stop for you. The officer makes them stop. So his freedom of movement is deprived by the officer. That is a seizure. So let's try to determine when somebody is seized. Here we have a criminal, an officer saying, stop, police, and this person takes off. When would that person be seized? Is that person seized when the officer says stop, but the person continues to run? Or is the person seized if the officer chases after him? And that's what we're about to learn. Hopefully you know the answer to that, because one of your homework assignments was to read and brief the case Hodara-D. And Hodara-D has to do directly with that question, when is a person seized? So you should know the answer to that. And there are two ways of seizing someone. And here I just want to take a minute and explain something or clarify something. We're going to learn two ways of seizing someone, and we're also going to learn two classes or two types of seizures. Don't get them confused. And there will be questions on the exam. One is going to ask you, what are the two ways someone is seized? And the other question is going to be, what are the two classes of seizures? So the first we're going to learn are the two ways someone is seized, or when somebody is seized. And the first is what we call a show of authority seizure. In other words, stop, police. The officer is showing their authority. The second way is what we call a physical seizure. And we'll get into each of these individually. Let's start off with a show of authority seizure, which is the first way somebody is seized. In order for there to be a show of authority seizure, first, the officer must show their authority. And that could be by conduct or words. An officer saying, stop, police. That is showing his or her authority. But that person is not seized yet, because there's two requirements for a show of authority seizure. And the second is the person submits to that authority. So if the officer says, stop, police, and that person does not stop, that person is not seized yet. Because in order for there to be a show of authority seizure, the person must submit to that authority that the officer is showing. Until they do that, it's not a seizure. You really need to understand that. Another example would be a motor vehicle stop. If an officer sees somebody run a red light, and the officer gets behind that person and puts their emergency lights on to detain them, when is that person seized? Let's break it down. Is it a show of authority? Yes. Putting the lights on, police officer putting their overhead emergency lights on, is showing their authority. Telling the person, pull over. So that's a show of authority. That person is not seized until that person pulls over. If the person puts on the gas and takes off, that person's not seized yet. The person is not seized until they submit to the authority of the police. And in the case of a motor vehicle stop, that is when the person pulls over. Now they're seized. As soon as they stop their car, they pull over and they stop, now they are seized. They are the officer showed the authority and they have submitted to that authority. But what if a person doesn't listen to the officer's command? When would that person be seized? So if the officer says, stop police, and the person says, screw that, and they take off running, and the officer chases that person, A, is that person seized? And B, if not, when are they seized? And that brings us to Hodara D. Again, I hope you read the case. It's important for you to do your homework assignments and to read the cases. And I'll be able to tell from answers on exams whether or not somebody reads a case. So hopefully you briefed this case. And in Hodara D, a juvenile was standing on the street corner and ran when he saw a police car approaching. The officer got out of his car and shouted, "Stop, police." The juvenile ignored the officer, so the officer chased after him. During the chase, the juvenile discarded something. The officer caught up with him and tackled the juvenile. The officer went back and found the discarded item, and it was crack cocaine. So when the juvenile began to run from the police and the officer said, "Stop, police," was the juvenile seized at that point? Let's break this down. When the officer showed his authority and shouted, "Stop, police," was he seized then? So let's answer if it was a show of authority seizure. Step one, the police must show authority. Step two, the person must submit to that authority. So when the officer showed his authority and shouted, "Stop, police," was the juvenile seized then? The answer is no, because the juvenile did not submit to it. Whenever you see a 2-part or 3-part or 4-part test, all the parts must be there. If one is missing, then it didn't happen. In this case, it's a 2-part test, show of authority and submitting to that authority. We have the show of authority, stop police, but the juvenile did not submit to the authority. So he was not seized yet. Was he seized when the officer began to chase him? The answer to that is no, because if he's chasing him, that means the juvenile is running and hasn't submitted to the authority yet. The 2 steps are not there. How about when he tackled the officer, when the officer tackled him? The juvenile didn't submit to the authority. The officer tackled him. So it's not a submission to authority seizure. However, when the officer tackled him, that was another type, another class, or another way somebody is seized. And that's what we call a physical seizure. The juvenile did not submit to his authority, so he was not seized until the officer tackled him. So it wasn't a submission to authority type of seizure. It was a physical seizure. And that's what Hodara D, what the case decided, is that once the officer physically restrains the suspect is seized, even though the person did not submit to the authority. So with a physical restraint seizure, it's irrelevant whether the person submits to the authority. It's when the officer uses some type of physical restraint. So we have submission to authority, which requires two parts. The officer show the authority and the person submit to it. And then we have another seizure called physical restraint seizure. And that's when the officer uses physical restraint to detain the person. They are both seizures. One is not better than the other. They're just different seizures, but they're both seizures. So if the person does not submit to the authority and the officer has to use some type of physical restraint, it now becomes a physical restraint seizure. And whether the person submitted or not is irrelevant. And in Hodardi, let's go back to the facts for a minute. So we already said that the juvenile was not seized until he was tackled. And we know that the officer, if you read the case, we know the officer had no suspicion to stop the juvenile. And running from the police, as a side note, running from the police alone without any other facts is not enough reasonable suspicion for the police to detain that person. There has to be something else, like a recent crime or a high crime area or some other suspicious behavior along with the running from the police. So running from the police alone, if that's the only fact, then that is not reasonable suspicion. So when the officer started chasing after the juvenile, the officer did not have any reasonable suspicion to detain the juvenile. And during the chase, the juvenile discarded something. So he wasn't seized yet. Because he wasn't seized yet, anything that happens prior to the seizure is going to be allowed in court. It's not going to be excluded because he wasn't seized yet. He was seized when he was tackled. And we learned that the officer did not have any suspicion to seize him. Therefore, the seizure was illegal because he didn't have any suspicion. So when he tackled him, he seized him. He did so with any suspicion. Remember, running from the police alone is not enough reasonable suspicion. So the officer did not have enough suspicion to seize him. So anything that happened after this seizure, because the seizure was illegal without reasonable suspicion, anything found after the seizure is going to be excluded because the seizure was illegal. Anything before the seizure is going to be allowed because they weren't seized yet. So the Fourth Amendment did not come into play yet. Remember, the Fourth Amendment only comes into play when the person is seized. So yes, the officer's chasing him. The officer did not have any legal suspicion to detain him, but he wasn't seized yet. So because he wasn't seized, even though the officer was chasing him, there was no violation of the Fourth Amendment by the officer because he wasn't seized yet. The violation of the Fourth Amendment only comes after the officer seized him, because when he seized him, he did so without any reasonable suspicion. So anything that happens before that illegal seizure, any evidence as a result of that prior to the illegal seizure is going to be admitted into court. Any evidence as a result after the illegal seizure is not going to be admitted. So he discarded the crack cocaine before the officer seized him. So that cocaine is going to be allowed. anything found after the officer seized him then is not going to be allowed. Now, don't get confused because the officer went back. Yes, that happened after the seizure, but what we're focusing on is what the juvenile did before the seizure. And before the seizure, he discarded that crack cocaine. So that happened before the seizure. So that is going to be allowed. If the officer found on the juvenile after he tackled him and searched him after he tackled him and found an illegal gun, then that gun would not be allowed because that gun came as a result of the illegal seizure. Discarding the crack cocaine did not come because or as a result of an illegal seizure because he wasn't seized yet. He was still being chased. He wasn't physically seized, and it wasn't a submission to authority seizure because he didn't submit to it. So I hope you understand that because there will be questions on the midterm about that. So let's just quickly review it. There are two ways or when someone is seized. It's a show of authority seizure, where the police show authority and the person must submit to the authority. If the person doesn't submit, then it is not a show of authority seizure, not seized yet. And then the second way somebody is seized is by a physical submit. And submission to that is not needed. So if the person is walking away and the officer grabs a hold of that person, at that moment, that person is seized by a physical restraint. And whether or not the person submitted to that is irrelevant. The officer used physical restraint, which only requires that. Show of authority requires that the person submit to the authority. Now let's move on to degree of suspicion. If it's not a voluntary encounter, the police need some level of suspicion to seize that person. Depending on the type of seizure or the class of seizure will depend on how much suspicion the police will need. So we learned in Hodara D that the officer did not have any reasonable suspicion. So when he tackled him, that was an illegal seizure because he had no level of suspicion. And there are two classes or two types of seizures. Remember, we just learned two ways or when someone is seized. Now we're going to learn the two different classes or the two types of seizures. And the first is an investigative stop, sometimes called a temporary detention. Those two terms are interchangeable. Investigative stop, temporary detention. So if you hear me say temporary detention, it's the same as me saying investigative stop and vice versa. And you'll see after each class or type of seizure, investigative stop has limited and arrest has full. And I'll explain that as we go along. So what is the difference between an investigative stop and a full seizure or an arrest? Investigative stops are temporary. That's why they're called temporary detainments sometimes. They are less intrusive than arrests. And they must be brief. Because less suspicion is needed, it must be less intrusive than an arrest. As we're going to learn, for the police to make an investigative stop or a temporary detention, the level of suspicion they need is called reasonable suspicion. If the police are going to arrest somebody, they need a higher level of suspicion meaning more evidence, and that's called probable cause. So to make an investigative stop, the police need reasonable suspicion. To make an arrest, the police need probable cause. And since police only need reasonable suspicion, which is less than probable cause, to make an investigative stop, then investigative stops must be less intrusive than an arrest. The police don't have a lot of information. They only have reasonable suspicion. So because of that, the police are not going to be able to do as much. They're going to be able to do less than if it was an arrest. When police make an arrest, they have at least probable cause, and that's going to allow them to be more intrusive, to search the person, put them behind bars, where an investigative stop, less suspicion is required, so the police have to be less intrusive. They can't bring them to the police department. They can't fully search them because they're operating on lesser suspicion. Let's take a look at where probable cause and reasonable suspicion come in on a scale. So we start off with 0%, meaning no suspicion at all. And then we can add a hunch to it. But a hunch is not enough for the police to detain somebody. 0% and a hunch is enough for the police to ask somebody, can I speak with you? Can you stop and talk to me? But it's not enough to detain that person, whether it be an arrest or an investigative stop or a temporary detention. After a hunch comes reasonable suspicion. Now, when the police have reasonable suspicion, now they can detain somebody temporarily. They can make that investigative stop. If the police have probable cause, and we're going, as we move along, each step is a higher level of suspicion. So probable cause is a higher level of suspicion than reasonable suspicion. Now at probable cause, the police can arrest somebody. And then we have beyond a reasonable doubt, which is what the state or the prosecution needs in order to convict somebody of a crime. So that is obviously a higher standard than probable cause, because that is even more intrusive. Now that person is going to be convicted of a crime. So because of the intrusiveness of that has to be more evidence than probable cause. So as we move along to the right, more evidence is required to meet that standard. And then 100%. So you can see reasonable doubt is not 100%. It's close to 100%, but it's not 100%. So let's take a look at it a different way. So let's start over to the right with beyond a reasonable doubt. You can see it's just under 100%, the probability of guilt. Very high standard. And then we have probable cause, which means their probability of guilt is a little more than 50%. And then reasonable suspicion, the probability of guilt is somewhere between 30–40%. And then a hunch is just a very low probability of guilt. So each level of suspicion has a higher probability of guilt. And the higher probability of guilt, the more intrusive the police or the state or the government can be. The lesser the probability of guilt, the less intrusive they can be. That's why an arrest the police can be more intrusive than a temporary detention because the probability of guilt is higher. So temporary detention or investigative stop has less suspicion, so the police aren't going to be able to do as much. So how do the police get to that? how do they determine how much suspicion there is? How do we determine whether it's reasonable suspicion or probable cause? And there's no black and white answer to that. Every scenario is different. It's like the old saying, you'll know it when you see it. And the level of suspicion, whether it's reasonable suspicion or probable cause, when the police make that determination, then it's going to be up to a judge or jury to determine whether the police were right or not when they said that they had reasonable suspicion or they said they had probable cause. And this is our first introduction into the totality of the circumstances test. And we will use this test quite often for the rest of the semester. And what the totality of the circumstances test is, it's kind of exactly what the title says, is we identify all the facts and circumstances of the situation. And then we weigh them. We weigh all the facts and circumstances, and then we make that determination that, you know what, there's not enough facts and circumstances here to even reach reasonable suspicion, or there is enough, there are enough facts and circumstances that we feel it rises to probable cause. And even though a judge makes that determination or a jury, usually when it's reasonable suspicion or probable cause, a judge will make that determination, because that means that the defendant is challenging it. The defendant is saying the police did not have reasonable suspicion to detain me or probable cause to arrest me. So now a judge has to make that decision whether or not the police did have reasonable suspicion or probable cause. And when the judge does that, the judge does it through the lens of a trained police officer. And the reason for that is because police see things differently than the average person. What a police officer sees may mean something different than when an average citizen sees it. We'll get into that a little more detail as we go along. But for now, know that when a judge is reviewing and making the determination of whether there's reasonable suspicion or probable cause, they do it as though they were the police officer. And what would a reasonable, there's that word, would a reasonable police officer believe based on all the facts and circumstances of the situation? And how do they make that decision? How does a judge make that decision? It's what the police put in their reports that they testify to. So police, when they fill out their arrest reports or any other report, they must do so, and they must put in all the facts and circumstances that led them to that conclusion that there was reasonable suspicion to detain the person or there was probable cause to arrest them. If they don't put all the facts and circumstances in that report, then how is somebody supposed to know whether that decision was correct or not? And there's a saying in police work that if it's not in the report, then it didn't happen. And that's why police officers are trained to be as thorough and as articulate as possible when they're writing their police reports. They have to put in all the facts and circumstances so that when it's reviewed, the person that's reviewing it is able to say, I can now see why the officer did that, because all these facts and circumstances adds up to probable cause or reasonable suspicion. Or if the officer fails to put in all those facts and circumstances, leaves some out, then the person will say that, or the person reviewing it will say, there's not enough facts and circumstances for the officer to make that determination. So here is a real life example. And for video question number 2, what I want you to do here is I think it's question number 7. Question number 7 on your homework assignment says video question 2. And The question that I want you to answer is, at what point do you think there was A, reasonable suspicion, and B, probable cause? And I'm going to give you a set of facts coming up. And when you reach the level of reasonable suspicion, then you put that as your answer. When you reach the level of probable cause, put that as your answer for probable cause. This was a couple years ago, and it's the position I had at the police department at the time. I was the captain of patrol division, and the officers did a report, and all these facts were in the report. And then at the end of the report, it didn't say that they were arrested. And after reading the report, I was expecting to see that that person was arrested, and they were not. And the reason the officer gave was, and this was a sergeant with a lot of years on the job, more than what I had on at the time, actually, a sergeant who said that he felt like there wasn't probable cause to arrest the person. So let's go through this. And again, this is a real life. These are facts that happened and facts that were in the police report. And in this one area of the city, there were recent car breaks. So this one area had experienced several car breaks over the past couple of weeks. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. A witness called the police and said they saw 2 males with a flashlight rummaging through a vehicle. It was during the winter and there was snow. The police responded to that area and they saw 2 sets of footprints in the snow going away from the vehicle that was being rummaged through. One set of footprints had a distinguishable feature. So something about those footprints in the snow made it different. An officer sees 2 males 1 street over. So again, tell me when you think the police have a reasonable suspicion to detain the person, and then probable cause to arrest them. So an officer sees 2 males 1 street over. It's 10 degrees outside and both are sweating. So the officers detained the 2 males. It's 10 degrees outside and both are sweating. So at this point, do you think there was reasonable suspicion to detain the males? Before we get to the 10 degrees outside, at this point, do you think that there is enough facts for the officers to have reasonable suspicion to detain those 2 males based on everything you see here? It's 10 degrees outside, both are sweating. One of them has a watch in his hand. He says he found it. One has a flashlight in his pocket. Again, now I want you to tell me when you think there's probable cause to arrest these 2. Both give inconsistent stories. They both tell different stories that don't match up to each other. And one suspect has boots on that match the footprints in the snow. You remember one set of prints had distinguishable features? Well, one of the suspects was wearing a pair of boots that matched this distinguishable feature. On all these facts, I can tell you legally there was probable cause to arrest them. What I want you to do for video question 2, which is question 7, is to tell me if there was reasonable suspicion to detain the males, and then B, when you think there was probable cause to arrest them. When there were enough facts in your mind that led up to probable cause, that added up to probable cause. So that's video question number 2. And that takes us to, we're going to talk now about investigative stops. And that brings us to the case Terry versus Ohio, one of the most famous cases. And again, you were supposed to brief this case, read it and brief it. So hopefully you'll have all the facts and understand it as we work our way through it. One important thing to understand is prior to this case, Terry, which was in the 1960s, there was only one type or one class of seizure, and that was an arrest. So now we have 2 types. We have 2 classes of seizures. We have the investigative stop, and we have arrest. Before this case, before Terry, there was only one type of seizure, and that was an arrest. So every time the police detained somebody, that was considered an arrest. And in Terry versus Ohio, the court carved out another type or another class of seizure. That's what Terry was all about. So there's some brief facts. Officer McFadden had 30 years on the same beat. Think about that. He worked in the same beat area for 30 years. So you think he knew his beat pretty well? I would hope so, after working the same beat for 30 years. And he notices 2 men walk by and look into a store window alternately 24 times. So they did this 24 times. They walked by and looked into a store window, and then they conferred with a man, a third man on the corner. So they'd walk by, look in the store, and then continue on and then meet up with this third man. And they did this 24 times. So what do you think the Officer McFadden, was thinking at the time? Hopefully you're thinking that in his mind, they were casing the store to rob it. If 2 men walking by 24 times, looking in, and then a third man on the corner that they meet up with, and then separate again, and then go look in the store, walk by, look in, and then meet up with him again. So the officer thinks that they're trying to rob the place. Now, as a side note, when you brief your case, do not use my facts. You brief your own case. So when I see your case briefs, you should have done them. They should be done already. And you do not use my facts. Your briefs have to contain your own facts. And besides, these are not all the facts either. I'm just going through it briefly. The officer approached the male and asked for their names. So why did he approach them? Because he thought that they were casing the store to rob it. The men mumbled something. And after they mumbled something, he couldn't hear what they were saying. They mumbled it. He grabbed one of them, Terry, and spun him around to pat him down. So the issue, and much like the facts, you ought to come up with your own issue and not use the issue that I state here. A very short issue is whether and when Terry was seized, and what level of suspicion was needed to seize Terry. So the court was trying to determine 2 things. Was he seized? And if he was seized, what level of suspicion was needed? And the court first said, yes, he was seized under the Fourth Amendment. Why? Because it was a physical seizure. The officer grabbed onto him, so he was seized. But was he arrested? And the court said no. And this is where the court said that we are going to create another type of seizure. We have arrest, but now we're going to create this new type of seizure, and we're going to call it an investigative stop. The court did not feel he was arrested, but he was seized under the Fourth Amendment. So they created a new type of seizure called an investigative stop. And when was he seized? Was he seized when the officers approached him? No. Because remember, the police can approach somebody without any level of suspicion. And if it's a voluntary encounter, then the person's not seized. He was seized when the officer grabbed him and spun him around. Now, if they were walking away and the officer said, "Stop, police, I want to talk to you," then that would be a submission to authority seizure. That's not what happened here. He grabbed them and spun him around. That's when he was seized. And he was seized by a physical restraint. And now the court had to determine what level of suspicion is needed if it's going to be not an arrest. If it's going to be a temporary detention, then what level of suspicion is needed for the police to make this new type of seizure that we just created? Is it going to be reasonable suspicion or probable cause? And the court said it's reasonable suspicion. And when did Officer McFadden have reasonable suspicion? He had it when he asked for their names and mumbled something. Personally, I think he might have had it even beforehand, based on the amount of times that they walked by and looked in the store and met up with the third guy. I think there was reasonable suspicion before they mumbled something, but definitely when they mumbled something, that was another fact that we add in under the totality of the circumstances that added up to reasonable suspicion. And the court said that they're going to allow this new type of seizure based on less than probable cause. So prior to Terry, the police needed probable cause to seize somebody because there was only one type of seizure called an arrest. Now, the court said we're going to create a new type of seizure called a temporary detention. And because it's a temporary detention, we're going to allow the police to make that type of seizure based on less than probable cause. We're going to allow them to do it based on reasonable suspicion. And they do so, they allow it because the police need to investigate crimes. And they balance that versus the intrusion on the person. And the person is only being temporarily detained. That's less of an intrusion than if they're being arrested. So it's not much of an intrusion. And the balance and the need to prevent crime kind of outweighs that minor intrusion of a temporary detention. And that's why they allow the police to make that stop or that seizure, that temporary detainment, based on reasonable suspicion. So in order for a Terry stop, and let me stop right there. Terry stop, temporary detention, investigative stop, all three mean the same exact thing. And I use them interchangeably because that's how they're used in real life interchangeably. So I don't want you to get used to just one term. I'll use all terms because I want you to know that they all mean the same. A Terry stop is the same as a temporary detention, is the same as an investigative stop. So the constitutional requirements for a Terry stop is reasonable suspicion. That's the standard, is reasonable suspicion that criminal activity is afoot. So the police need at least reasonable suspicion that there's some type of criminal activity going on. Did Officer McFadden have reasonable suspicion that those three guys were up to criminal activity? I think he did. Again, casing it and meeting up with the third guy and then mumbling an answer to when the officer asked him a question. That all adds up to reasonable suspicion that these guys are up to some type of criminal activity. In order for it to be constitutional, it must be as brief as possible. And it must be the least intrusive means of detention and investigation as possible. And why? Why does it have to be as brief as possible? And why does it have to be as least intrusive as possible? And the reason is because there's a lesser standard of reasonable suspicion. An arrest is more intrusive than a temporary detention. The police need more suspicion for an arrest, so they can be more intrusive. For a temporary detention, it must be less intrusive than an arrest because the police have less suspicion. So because there's a lesser standard called reasonable suspicion, then it has to be brief, has to be less intrusive than arrest. So it has to be as brief as possible and the least intrusive means of detaining that person as possible. If it's too intrusive, it will turn into a de facto arrest. There's the first time we see that term that we learned at the beginning of this presentation. If the detention, if the seizure is too intrusive, the court's going to say that's an arrest. You went beyond what is allowed in a temporary detention as far as being too intrusive. Therefore, we're going to consider this an arrest now. You may say it was a temporary detention, but you was too intrusive for it to be a temporary detention. Therefore, we're going to consider this an arrest. And if it's an arrest, we know that the police need probable cause to make that arrest. And if they detain this person, if they seize this person based on reasonable suspicion, but the court says it wasn't a temporary seizure, it was an arrest, that's an illegal arrest because they did it with reasonable suspicion rather than probable cause. And that's why it's very important for the police to articulate all the facts they have and to be as specific as possible. If the police temporarily detain somebody based on reasonable suspicion, but they hold that person too long, they hold that person for 3 hours, or they get too intrusive, they take them to the police department, all that intrusion is associated with being arrested. Therefore, the court is going to call that a de facto arrest. And the officer is doing all that based on reasonable suspicion, which makes that de facto arrest illegal because arrest must be based on probable cause. So the result of Terry was that it created the investigative stop, also known as a Terry stop or a temporary detention. And the rule, you need to know this rule, the Terry rule is the police may temporarily detain someone when the officer has reasonable suspicion to believe the person has committed, is committing, or about to commit a crime. In other words, criminal activity is afoot. This is the rule for a temporary detention or a Terry stop or an investigative stop. This is the rule. So what is reasonable suspicion? The court defined it as facts and circumstances that would lead a reasonable person to believe criminal activity is afoot. The facts themselves the officer must be able to articulate particular facts. So the officer has to, in his or her report, articulate what those facts are. Can't say, I just had a hunch. I had a hunch he was breaking into cars. That's not good enough. What led you to believe he was breaking into cars? Well, it was 2 o'clock at night. It was cold out. He was sweating. He had boots on that matched the prints. So you see how now those facts are articulated. And now somebody can say, okay, based on those facts that you just articulated, there is now reasonable suspicion or probable cause. A hunch is not good enough. It must be based on objective facts and not a gut feeling, which is a hunch. The officer must be able to articulate particular facts. And what are these articulable facts? Well, something concrete and factual that the officer can demonstrate. So, I had a feeling he didn't look right to me. That's not good enough. They have to be able to articulate something concrete and factual. The facts themselves don't have to be suspicious. In fact, they can be perfectly innocent facts that add up to reasonable suspicion. Remember, I told you earlier that the police see things differently than citizens do. So what may be a perfectly innocent fact, when added up to other innocent facts, can amount to reasonable suspicion. Let's go back to that real life example. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. That's a perfectly innocent fact. There's nothing illegal about being out at 2 o'clock in the morning. The person was sweating. There's nothing illegal about that, right? So that's an innocent fact. But you start adding these innocent facts together, and that can add up to reasonable suspicion. So perfectly innocent facts can add up. A fact in and of itself may be innocent, but when coupled with other innocent facts, can amount to reasonable suspicion. So let's take a look at some innocent facts. A person in a high crime area. That's an innocent fact. People live in high crime areas. People do business in high crime areas. So a person being in a high crime area is an innocent fact. That alone is not enough for the police to stop somebody. It's an innocent fact. The area of a recent crime. Again, that's an innocent fact. I am in my office right now next to a couple other different stores. If one of those stores were robbed, I'm right next to it, and that's innocent. This is where my office is. So being in the area of a recent crime in and of itself is an innocent fact. Runs when they see the police. That's an innocent fact as well. Remember, I told you running from the police alone is not enough reasonable suspicion. It's an innocent fact. But let's add these three together. It's a high crime area. It was just a recent crime in this area. And when the person sees the officer, they run. Now you can see we're adding these innocent facts together. We start getting to reasonable suspicion. The person has a criminal record or in the company criminals. That's an innocent fact. But you add it with other ones, it may add up to reasonable suspicion. And I say may because it's going to depend on the circumstances. Inconsistent or unbelievable answers. a person's race matches the description of the suspect. Talk a minute about race. Obviously, the police can never detain somebody purely because of their race. However, their race can be a factor in adding up to reasonable suspicion. If they describe a white male, then the police are going to be looking for a white male. So race is an innocent fact, but if it matches the description of the suspect, along with these other factors, then that can add into the equation of reasonable suspicion. And if the person is nervous or fidgety. And these are just some examples of innocent facts. There's so many. But what I just wanted to do is show you that innocent facts in and of themselves don't really mean a lot. But you start combining them together, now through the totality of those facts, you've now reached the level of either reasonable suspicion or probable cause. So the totality of the circumstances is each one of those facts taken alone are innocent. However, if taken in the totality of the circumstances, they may add up to reasonable suspicion. In other words, look at all the facts and the circumstances surrounding the facts to determine if there's reasonable suspicion. That's how we make that determination. We look at everything. And some of that everything could be perfectly innocent facts. But when you put them together, it adds up to reasonable suspicion. So let's take a look at another example. Officer walking her beat. She sees two men standing on the corner. That's an innocent fact. A recent crime happened in the area. It's another innocent fact. The two men look away when they see her. That's an innocent fact. As she walks closer to them, they quickly walk away. All of these independently are innocent. Just take them separately, and it's an innocent fact. But if you combine these four innocent facts together, that adds up to reasonable suspicion. So another way, just to kind of visualize it, let's have a scale here. And on the left-hand side is no suspicion. Standing on the corner, is that enough to tip the scale? No. A recent crime, is that alone enough to tip the scale? No. They look away. That fact alone, without the other two, is that enough to tip the scale? No. They walk away. That fact alone, is that enough to tip the scale? No. However, if you put all those facts together, now that tips the scale. Independently, they have no effect on the scale, but you put them together, and now that's enough to tip the scale. And where do police get this information? Where do they get the information to make that determination if there's reasonable suspicion or probable cause? And they get it two ways. And what we've discussed so far is really just officers' personal observation. And then another way police get information is from members of the public. Let's take a look at officers' personal observation. Officers are trained observers. Again, I said this before, that what the police see, they see it differently because of their experience and training. So they can identify patterns of behavior that are suggestive of criminal behavior that non-police people would not likely see. What may seem like innocent behavior for a citizen may be suspicious to the officer. An example would be at an airport. Officers in airports are trained to identify certain behavior that that is consistent with drug dealing or drug trafficking. And these facts alone may mean nothing to the average person. But when the officer sees them, because of his or her training, then the officer is able to see something differently than what the average person would. So it's the officer's personal observation, because they're trained observers, that courts give more weight to what the officers see than what the average person would see. But really what I want to concentrate on is information from members of the public. And if the police receive information from the public, that information must be reliable. If the police are going to act on information from the public, we want it to be reliable. If it's not reliable, then that's not going to add up to reasonable suspicion. So if the police want to use information from the public, that information must be reliable. If it's not reliable, then we don't want it. We only want to use reliable information. And information from the public is not automatically reliable. Not everything we receive or police receive from the public is going to be reliable. And if it's not reliable, then it must be made reliable. And there are ways police can take this information and make it reliable. And how do the police make the information reliable? Well, the first way is the person themselves is reliable. And that's what we call a known informant. Or it could be a concerned, identified citizen with firsthand knowledge of the information. So the person is reliable if they're one of these two. A known informant. Police have informants. And if they have a known informant, especially if that known informant has supplied reliable information in the past, then that information the police get from that known informant is going to be reliable. And the other type is a concerned, identified citizen with firsthand knowledge of the information. So what's underlined is important here. You notice that the citizen is identified and they have firsthand knowledge of the information. So information from this type of person is reliable. So there's two types of reliable people: a known informant and a concerned, identified citizen with firsthand knowledge of the information. And then information is corroborated. So what if it's not a known informant? Or what if it's not firsthand knowledge? It's a rumor. Because not all the information police get are going to be from known informants, and some of it's going to be rumors. So information that is corroborated, it comes from an anonymous informant. In other words, the person calls the police and refuses to identify themselves, say, I want to remain anonymous, and however, here's some information for you. The police must now corroborate that information. Or an identified citizen, John Smith, calls and says, I heard a rumor that my neighbor is selling drugs. That's a rumor. So it must be corroborated. If it's John Smith who says, I just saw my neighbor deal drugs, that's reliable. They've identified themselves and they have firsthand knowledge. The police can act on that information. They don't have to corroborate it. However, if John Smith calls and says, hey, a few of my neighbors were saying that the guy next door is a drug dealer, the police can't use that information as reliable. They have to make it reliable. And they make it reliable by corroborating it. Same thing with an anonymous informant. Person calls and says, I just saw John Smith dealing drugs in front of 123 Main Street, but I'm not going to identify myself. Now, it's not a rumor, it's firsthand knowledge, but it's from an anonymous informant. Therefore, it must be corroborated. So let's first take a look at reliable informants. There's two types, a known informant and a concerned citizen. So the known informant is known to the police officer and has given accurate information in the past. That is a known, reliable informant. The other type of reliable informant is a concerned citizen. To be this type, they identify themselves and they have personal knowledge of the information. If they have personal knowledge, it does not have to be corroborated. If this known identified person reports a rumor, the police must corroborate that information. Let's look at an example. Mary calls the police, identifies herself, and gives her number and address. She tells the police that she heard a rumor that her neighbor, who she identifies, is selling drugs. What type of informant is this? This is a concerned citizen with a rumor. Does it need to be corroborated? Yes, it does. If there's a rumor involved, it's not firsthand knowledge from an concerned identified citizen, then it has to be corroborated. So yes, because it's a rumor, it has to be corroborated. Mary calls the police, identifies herself, gives her number and her address. She tells the police she just saw a man who she describes in detail run from her neighbor's house. She heard gunshots and screaming just prior to seeing the man running away. She saw him getting in this 2006 blue Chevy and drive west. What type of information is this? This is a concerned citizen with personal knowledge. Does this need to be corroborated? No, it does not, because it's a concerned citizen and it's not a rumor, it's an identified citizen. She identified herself and she had firsthand knowledge. Therefore, it does not need to be corroborated. It will be considered reliable. And anonymous tips. Anonymous tips are the least reliable form of information. If the police get an anonymous tip and they act on it, the courts are more than likely going to say that's not good enough. And why are they the least reliable form of information? Because the person's credibility is unknown. The prior example, we had either a known informant who's worked with the police and given reliable information, or a concerned citizen who identified themselves. So there's credibility there. But if the police just get a call from somebody and that person either refuses or doesn't identify themselves, we don't know anything about their credibility. It could be anybody. And it could be somebody with a vendetta against somebody else, providing the police with false information. So when it comes to anonymous tips, the police must always corroborate that information. And that leads us to video question number 3, which is number 17 on your homework assignment. And that question is, why are anonymous tips the least reliable form of information? And for number 17, where it says video question 3, you answer that because the person's credibility is unknown, and that makes the information unreliable. So let's take a look at a chart here. And this is also on e-learning on the Fourth Amendment material. And This will help break it down for you, at least visually. Information from the public. If it's a known informant, the police don't need to cooperate. If it's anonymous tip, always, always, always have to cooperate. If it's a concerned citizen and they have personal knowledge, they do not need to cooperate. If it's a concerned citizen that has a rumor, the police must corroborate that. And again, this is on e-learning. So we are going to stop there. And we will pick up after the midterm, which I believe will be after spring break, and we'll start part 2 of chapter 3. And the last, question number 18 on your homework assignment has to do with 3 cases. And that they have to do, those 3 cases have to do with what we just spoke about information from the public, known informant, anonymous tip, and concerned citizens. And the question is that on pages 114 to 116, the book talks about Alabama versus White, Florida versus JL, and Navarrete versus California. Compare and contrast each case and the court's decision in each of those cases. So what I want you to do is just a little paragraph for each case is describe very briefly what happened in the case and what the court decided in those cases. And then contrast them. How are they different? And why are they different? And you'll see that in your homework assignment. So when we pick up again, we will talk about those cases, Alabama versus White, Florida versus JL, and Navarrete. We will talk about those questions in more detail in the second part of chapter 3. That's where we will pick up. Okay, so I will be sending out information on the midterm shortly. And if you have any questions in the meantime, please let me know. Thank you.